The 75th anniversary of Israel. That's the topic of today's Bold and Blunt. And I'm your host, Cheryl Chumley, giving you a Christian conservative look at today's news, politics, culture, and events. All eyes on Israel. And as one USA Today headline just pitched, on their nation's 75th anniversary, Israelis ask, is this still a democracy? Before I get into more of that, I want to quickly mention, if you like Bold and Blunt, you may get Bold and Blunt at edify.app, the online platform for your faith-based podcasts, at washingtontimes.com, where you may also subscribe to my 3 times a week newsletter. Just find the newsletter section, click on it, find Bold and Blunt with Cheryl Chumley in the newsletter section, click on that. And then quickly sign up for my newsletter that comes out Monday, Wednesdays, and Fridays right to your email box. Contains my commentaries that I write all day long at the Washington Times, as well as my twice weekly Bold and Blunt podcast. One more quick mention. If you don't want to go through that, you can just go to your search engine online. Type in Bold and Blunt with Cheryl Chumley and subscribe to my podcast there. It's wherever podcasts are offered. If you haven't been paying attention to what's been taking place in Israel right now, well, here's a quick primer. So Benjamin Netanyahu is once again in charge. He won prime minister re-election, right? And one of the first things he wanted to do was enact some judicial reforms. Why? Because Israel, and this rings a bell to those who follow politics and the judicial system in America, Israel has been facing some issues with accusations of ding, ding, judicial activism. And it's part and parcel, it's wound up in their judicial system. And so Netanyahu wanted to bring about some judicial reforms. And like a drum roll beat, here came the left, here came the leftists, here came, can I say, even the deep staters in Israel to fight his very much needed reforms. And so those have been put on standstill. And now, of course, the media, just as in America, the media does its work for the left in Israel. And now you have media in Israel drumming up the protest movement against Benjamin Netanyahu's proposed reform. So that is a basic primer, and just reading a little bit from this USA Today piece ahead of the month-long break from the Passover holiday recess. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu paused his efforts to get the reforms approved by lawmakers. Speaking of the judicial reforms, of course, back to USA Today. He wanted to lower the political temperature. He had good reason, USA Today writes. Quoting again from this piece, since January, hundreds of thousands of Israelis on most Saturdays, the Jewish Sabbath, have angrily taken to the streets to protest the proposed overhaul. There have also been smaller pro-reform counter-protests, mostly in Jerusalem and Jewish settlements in the West Bank, a perennially volatile area partly administered by the Palestinian National Authority, but effectively controlled by Israel's military. As many as 200,000 people, police said, gathered on the evening of April 27th in support of the judicial overhaul. So again, that's a little bit more of a primer, but there is nothing like hearing from those on the ground of a foreign nation when reporting on foreign affairs to get a more truthful assessment of what's going on. And today I have with me a guest, Gol Kalev, who is just such a person on ground in Israel. Gol, thank you so much for being on Bold and Blunt. I really appreciate your time. So you are in Israel, you live in Israel. How long have you been in Israel, and exactly what is your job title there?
I've been in Israel since the beginning of the 20th century through my grandparents on both sides. I was born in Israel, in Tel Aviv. I'm a third-generation Tel Avivian. And after I served in the army, I lived in New York for many years. I went I did my MBA and was an investment banker on Wall Street for a few years. And when I came back, I did a complete career change. And I've been a journalist, writing mostly for the Jerusalem Post. And I also wrote a book called Judaism 3.0, Judaism's Transformation to Zionism, where I argue that Judaism is going through a historic transformation and Zionism is becoming its anchor. I'm showing how both Jews and non-Jews relate to Judaism primarily through the prism of Zionism and Israel, whether it's in the positive or in the negative, and a lot of it is in the negative. So whatever historical relations there were to Judaism, now it's funneled a lot of it through the prism of Zionism.
And I want to talk more about the significance of that historic switch and your book in just a few minutes. But there's some interesting news coming out of Israel. There's always interesting news coming out of Israel. But when Benjamin Netanyahu came back into power, one of the first things he wanted to do was reform the legal system, reform the justice system over there. And it's been put to a stop because of some backlash. Can you explain what the reform that he wanted to implement was and where it's going and why it actually matters?
Yeah, that's certainly a hot topic in Israel, part of an extraordinarily hot topic since really the beginning of this government a few months ago. I think if it's okay with you, I want to place it a little bit in the context of Israel's political history.
Yes.
Because that's a lot of it is really that. So Israel, since its founding in 1948 until 1977, was ruled by one party, the Labor Party and its various derivatives, sort of roughly the equivalent of the Democratic Party in the U.S. But it was, they ruled the country not just in terms of ruling the legislative and the executive branch. It was in complete homogeny. The civil service, the courts, the business sector, the unions. If you wanted to get certain jobs or certain position, you need to bring a note from the party that you're quote unquote our crowd, that you're a member of the party as opposed to the opposite party. So for Israel's first 30 years or so, the Labor Party controlled everything, and things worked. It was perceived that things are working. In 1977, something shocking happened, and the Likud party, which is roughly equivalent of the Republicans, the right-wing party led by Begin and today by Benjamin Netanyahu, took control and stayed more or less in power for the next 45 years until today with a few brief interruptions. Israel is a permanent right-wing majority. The vast majority of Israelis, certainly Israeli Jews, but the vast majority of Israelis in general, vote for right-wing parties. And that's been more or less the reality that the Likud and related right-wing parties and coalition members win control of government since 1977. But while the Likud wins the elections, the civil service, the judicial system, the academia, the media, that all stayed. They never try and fix that or clean it up or change that. There was different historians point to different things. I mean, most people think it was somewhat of a decision of Menachem Begin to not to shake the system too much. So the reality is that the legal system is more or less a reflection of the Israeli electorate of the 1970s. There were three developments over the last couple, 20 years or so that led the vast majority of Israelis to say we need legal reform. One of them is in the 1990s, where the Chief Justice, Aaron Barak, decided to take additional responsibilities or authorities to the court. People call that the legal revolution of that time, or the judicial revolution. So he turned the Supreme Court of Israel to be extraordinarily activist, and basically did all kinds of things, including use the test of reasonability. So the people elect their parliament, the parliament legislates, and the Supreme Court, since the 1990s, is in a position to say, well, I don't think that law is reasonable, so I'm overruling it. And other things that we can get into because of the time, but that became very, very activist. Now, to their defense, they said, look, Israel, unlike the United States, does not have a constitution. And Israel also has the same party ruling for a long time, so we need, some sort of a check by a more activist court. So this has been, one thing, a very activist that's been in place to the point that a lot of people feel very frustrated about the democratic system that we elect people, and then the courts sometimes override them. The second thing is the increasing power of what's known in Israel as the legal advisor. The legal advisor has nothing to do with advising. The legal advisor is sort of like the ultimate, the person that ultimately needs to approve the actions of the government. So the prime minister and the government has their legal advisor, and then every department has a legal advisor. The Department of Transportation, the Department of Labor, and those the legal advisor of the Department of Transportation does not report to the Minister of Transportation. He reports to the chief legal advisor. So if, for example, the Minister of Transportation says, I want to put a bus stop on this particular street, the legal advisor can say, no, it's against the law. Or he can even say, no, it's not reasonable that you will put it here. And the Minister of Transportation, that, byproduct of the election, cannot do anything about it other than to petition the Supreme Court and basically sue his legal advisor.
Wow.
Defenders of the system says, well, what if the minister says I'm going to put a bus stop here because my cousin lives next door, or so defenders of the system says, well, the legal advisor is sort of a responsible adult, and which not just based on his judgment, based on the law. But since the court has been very activist, so has the legal advisor been very activist, and sometimes block government actions that are not clearly against the law, that are certainly in the gray zone and has to do with a reasonability test.
Right.
That includes the security issue. That includes in Israel's defense against terrorism, which triggered a lot of people in Israel over the last 10, 20 years to say, wait a minute, this, why nobody elected him or her? And so that's the two things. And the third is the way we select judges in Israel, which unlike in the United States, which is basically, at the end of the day, politicians that select judges, the president, including the Supreme Court and other, in federal levels, the president nominates, the legislator confirms. In Israel, it's elected through a committee that, at the end of the day, is controlled by existing Supreme Court judges. It's a little bit of a complicated math. There's a number of, you need to have a particular supermajority, but the end result is that the judges select themselves. They both select who will be the next judges, and usually the candidates are people who are legal advisors, as well as lawyers and people in academia. And then they decide who will get promoted through the system, through the higher levels of courts, and ultimately decide who will be appointed to the Supreme Court. Now, there's a committee. It's not like it's a bit more complicated than that. But that, again, perpetuates the demographic realities and electoral realities of Israel in the 1970s, where those judges and the predecessor of those judges were there. There is a very low reflection of democracy, of the people's will. And again, defenders of the system says, well, but we want judges that are not accountable to politicians. We want judges who are professionals, and if politicians elect judges, like in the United States, then they'll be accountable to them. And we might have in Israel, for example, in the United States, you had 2000 in Gol versus Bush, where Supreme Court judges voted along party lines, who nominated them, and maybe it was a coincidence. But we want, independent judiciary, and therefore let us, the judges who know how the system works, select our, sort of have a unusual influence, in combination with lawyers, in combination with people in the government, people in the parliament. So those three things basically led to a system that many people said it's not democratic. It's not, the court has an enormous amount of powers. It can override the parliament. The legal advisor can do the same. Nobody elected him. We vote, but our votes count less. And then there's a committee to select the future judges, and it just perpetuates the existing system. So that's why only, Cheryl, 6 months ago, you had almost a consensus. Consensus is exaggerated, but the vast majority of Israelis wanted legal reforms. The vast majority of Israelis on the left and on the right wanted to change this distortion, including the head of the opposition, the multiple heads of the opposition, but the head of the opposition, which is the official title, Yair Lapid, was at the forefront at opposing Bibi and opposing emphatically the legal reform. He was a strong supporter of it, just recently he said that the courts are negating the people's choices.
Right.
That the judges, he said, the head of the opposition, who now against it, said back then that judges act as these politicians are people who don't know how to govern, and we need to kind of overrule them. And he called, if I'm remembering correctly, the judges taking over as a takeover, a hostile takeover of the political discussion and decision-making process. So all of a sudden, so this is what we had up until the elections of Netanyahu. Netanyahu comes in and through his Minister of Justice wants to enact these legal reforms, and then something very interesting happens. And that is that all those people that were previously for the legal reform are adamantly against the legal reform.
Oh, wow. Let me just sum up what you described in a way that Americans can understand, because what I'm gathering from the three judicial-related issues that you outlined is akin to America's deep state type of politicking. You have judicial activism, but then you have the legal advisors that are almost the ultimate deep state type of control mechanisms in the government. Would that be fair?
And it's not just in America. I remember Tony Blair, when he became prime minister, he said about, look, I thought I was going to bring in my own people, but because the civil service in the UK is so strong, how can I enact policy? How can I change policy if the person who I need to, effectuate the policies from the other party? So yes, we have that. I would say this is a fair analogy. We also have our own deep state. We do have a very strong civil service. But I would just qualify that in the Israeli discourse, it's viewed in less of black and white terms. I mean, there is an appreciation of the role of the civil service and deep state and the judges. Nobody, it's probably a little bit more nuanced, but yes, this is a fair analogy. The kind of simplistically, the people elect. And then you have an unelected body that ultimately can override the people's, the choices of the politicians, the people elected.
Fascinating. And just briefly, because I do want to talk about your book, Judaism 3.0, and a couple of other matters before our time runs out. But briefly, where does the hopes for judicial reform stand in Israel? Is it dead on the water, or are there still hopes that it can be accomplished?
That's a very good question, and I think, and very layered. Because we don't know, because it's not just, that people change their mind. Some people say, well, all of a sudden we're against the legal reform. We're for legal reforms, but not this legal reform. It happened too fast. It happened without a consensus. We don't like this clause, that clause. So that can be discussed and negotiated, and there are discussions at the President's House exactly about that. But I think if you cut through this, it's not really about the legal reform.
Right.
It is about Bibi. It is about Benjamin Netanyahu, the prime minister, and the protesters who demonstrate it openly. Like, we're here because we don't want Bibi to be in power for too long. And it's about other things, including outside influence. And there's a coalition of interest here that kind of gathered around this legal reform process. And the actual merits that are legitimate, the concerns about, what this clause will do, that clause will do, I think we've been marginalized a little bit. So we don't know. We don't know who's... I think that if people are... there's not really a big difference between the opposition and the coalition in terms of the true view about how we should change the legal reform. But there are other forces that just kind of using that as a tool to unfit the government and do other things that are worse. So it's very hard to predict what's going to happen. In theory, this is supposed to renew once the Knesset, the parliament, comes back from its vacation in about a month. There
are some who see similarities between how Trump is treated by the left-wing factions in America to how Netanyahu is treated by similarly left-wingers in Israel. And I'm just curious, how does Israel view the Trump indictments? What do people that you speak with in Israel say about what's taking place in America right now, the indictments of Donald Trump?
Obviously, there's no official reaction from
Right.
Israel, but the people that you talk to, just about everybody makes the comparisons to Netanyahu's trial, because Netanyahu is also indicted. He's been indicted on charges that a lot of people, significantly more than half of all of his supporters and a big chunk of his opponents, view as frivolous or kind of at least strange. The charges including a reduction of negative news coverage as a currency for bribe, or receiving champagne bottles from his friends, and other things that come out in the trial. So people look at Trump, at the Trump indictment, and I think in the context of the debate, is the prosecutors' offices in Israel, in the United States, around the world, are basically politicized, are weaponized. And what does it mean, to the independence of the judiciary system?
Right.
If you have prosecutors that are, even if they're perceived by a big chunk of the population of using their powers for political reasons, that creates distrust in the system.
It's so interesting how politics are the same no matter where, right? Half a world away, and you guys in Israel are going through the same political battles that we in America are facing. And I know we could talk more about this, but I really do want to get into your book, Judaism 3.0, Judaism's transformation to Zionism. So as I understand, Zionism is just simply support for the Jewish state. And I find it fascinating that you see this as a transformation that's occurred, because I thought Zionism was already always part and parcel of Israeli culture and society.
It certainly is. Zionism is sort of the ideological bedrock that the Israeli state is planted in. But I'm saying one level above, that Zionism is basically becoming, that sooner or later Zionism will become synonymous with Judaism. That, Jews and non-Jews look at Judaism, and what they think about is Israel. That the national aspect of the Jewish nation religion is becoming the most relevant aspect, Zionism, for various reasons, including secularization in the United States. American Jews are not religious, and various other ideas. Just to connect to the previous conversation, Israelis are all, adamantly Zionists, and the protests for and against illegal reforms, the protesters carry Israeli flags, the Zionist flag. So I'm showing in the book, whether you're for it, against it, that has become the relevant aspect of Judaism. My American Jewish friends, in New York and elsewhere, they don't go to synagogue, and they don't think about the Holocaust anymore, which was the connector when the survivors' generations were around. But they get triggered when they hear something about Israel, usually in the negative. So you have a lot of friends who write a Facebook post, as a Jew, I'm embarrassed about Israel, given what they've done in Gaza. They never say, as a Jew, anything else. So that's just an example of how Zionism pulls you in the negative. We see how the age-old opposition to Judaism, what used to be traditional anti-Semitism, is now funneled through Israel. We see what things are happening in Europe, all kinds of things like, labeling products made by Jewish-owned businesses in the West Bank, Judean Samaria, all kinds of things that are, they even sacrifice the Palestinians' interest in order to take swipes at Israel, or to say in other words, take swipes at Judaism through Zionism. The founder of Zionism, we were here a lot, our modern Moses, as Benjamin Netanyahu calls him, is Theodor Herzl. He's the visionary of the Jewish state. He created basically modern-day Zionism. And one of his many brilliances was to recognize that European opposition to Judaism is permanent and not going away. It just changes its direction, and therefore it is a paradigm shift. And that's why Zionism, the Jewish state will be that paradigm shift, because once we have a Jewish state, it's not just a safe house for the Jews, but we will be able to negotiate with the opposition, as equals. And the world would want us, the Jewish state, because we will produce advancements in humanity that are unimaginable. That is exactly what is happening. So his Zionism is now becoming the most relevant aspect of Judaism. And I'm showing that in the book and in our discussions in our think tank, which your audience are welcome. We have the next one, April 30th. It's actually Herzl's birthday, which is a national holiday in Israel. For that, so we're having discussions, and we're showing how the various arenas, the Jewish communities, non-Jewish communities, the way that people look at Jews, global trends, including the ones we've just discussed, all support this transformative event in Judaism, just like the transformative event that happened 2,000 years ago when Judaism transformed into something else that it was when we were in Judea. Now we're back in Judea, and I'm showing how Judaism is transformed and Zionism has become its most relevant aspect, its organizing principle.
Is to be anti-Zionist the same as being anti-Semitic?
That is definitely. I mean, the short answer is yes, because
right.
Anti-Zionism, every few centuries, Judaism is under assault, but it's always under assault from the aspect of Judaism that's most relevant. When the temple was the most relevant of Judaism, and when the Greeks and Romans invaded here, the Romans eventually burned it down because that was how you assault Judaism. Now Zionism is the most relevant aspect of Judaism, and therefore anti-Zionism is the form to oppose Judaism. But that is what I'm doing with the book. It's just not a book. It's a think tank, and sort of so many events and so many people from all over the world that are supporters of this message. Because once there's a broad recognition that we are in Judaism 3.0, as I call it, that Zionism is the anchor of Judaism, then the Jew hater can no longer hide behind this fake facade that he loves the Jews but hates the Zionists.
Right.
Once we agree that we're in Judaism 3.0 and Zionism is the anchor of Judaism, anti-Judaism and anti-Zionism become synonymous. And that will deter haters, on all levels. Can you imagine CNN saying, Jews assassinate journalists, as they did to us in this horrible tragedy, but, the idea or the modern day life was that we targeted journalists or other things that we're being accused of. Once there's a recognition that Zionism is the anchor of Judaism, then it's going to be very hard to say, I love the Jews, but I hate the Zionists. And that will, I think, not just help us, but also help our Palestinian neighbors, because it will help us advance peace. We wouldn't incite the Palestinians as much from the outside.
Yes, your book and your premise of your book actually brings clarity to the situation where people, like you said, are forced to acknowledge whether they support the Jewish state or don't support the Jewish state, which is to say whether they support Jewish people or not. Brilliant assessment there. Judaism 3.0, Judaism's transformation to Zionism. Gol, where can people get your book and find out more about your writings?
Amazon and Barnes & Noble and Book Depository in stores, but you can also go to my website, to the book's website, which is Judaism-Zionism.com, or Google Judaism 3.0, but the website is Judaism-Zionism.com, and then there's a lot of resources on the website, so those who want to learn more are very welcome to visit Judaism-Zionism.com.
Excellent. Gol Kalev, you are a very informative guy, fascinating discussion. I want to thank you so much for taking the time all the way from Israel to be on Bold and Blunt today.
It was a pleasure.
And that's another wrap of Bold and Blunt. If you like Bold and Blunt, don't forget you can get Bold and Blunt at edify.app, at washingtontimes.com, and wherever podcasts are offered. Tune in next time. And in the meanwhile, don't forget, stay blunt, stay bold.